An inquiry is ordered into Britain's Contaminated Blood Scandal.
There are over 2,400 individuals who tragically lost their lives. They are not here to see this announcement, but their voice lives on through their family members who have never given up fighting for them.
The Prime Minister has ordered an inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal of the 1970s and 80s, saying victims had been denied answers for too long. More than 7,000 NHS patients were given imported blood products infected with hepatitis C or HIV. At least 2,400 have died. The government will consult victims and their families about the form the inquiry will take. Campaigners who've been demanding an inquiry for years claim there was a cover-up. Speaking in the Commons, the Health Minister, Philip Dunn, said many documents were already publicly available, but he accepted that victims felt they hadn't been told the whole truth.
In light of these concerns, and of reports of new evidence and allegations of potential criminality, we think it is important to understand the extent of what is claimed and the wider issues that arise.
Last Friday, 6 party leaders at Westminster wrote to Theresa May calling for a Hillsborough-style inquiry into why more than 2,000 people in Britain died in what the party leaders called one of the worst peacetime disasters in our country's history. Today, Theresa May announced what she called a wide-ranging inquiry. More than 2,000 deaths have been linked to the scandal in which people with haemophilia and others were infected with hepatitis C and HIV from imported blood products in the 1970s and 80s. The UK imported supplies of a clotting agent, some of which turned out to be infected. Much of the plasma used to make it came from donors, including prison inmates in the United States, who sold their blood. There have been calls for an inquiry for years. In 2015, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, apologised, but for many campaigners it wasn't enough. In his final speech as an MP in the House of Commons in April, the Labour MP and former Health Secretary Andy Burnham said there had been a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale and that victims had been guinea pigs.
I want to refocus everybody on giving victims what they have never had, the truth. From what I know, I believe that this scandal amounts to a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. And tonight I want to present direct evidence to support that claim. There are hundreds of victims of this scandal who can point to evidence of missing pages from their medical notes. Crucial pages missing from their medical notes.
That was Andy Burnham in April. He's now the Mayor of Greater Manchester and is still taking an interest in the blood scandal.
Without doubt, Eddie, it's a major breakthrough and a vindication of all of those people who never gave up. I mean, they've been in the wilderness for many, many years. They've been let down by all political parties. So today is a real vindication for them, but it's a day that has taken far, far too long in coming.
What accounts for that length of time?
A number of reasons. One being the nature of this disaster. It didn't happen in a particular city on a particular day and everyone can remember where they were. This happened silently, if you like, over many years and was quite spread out across the country, and that people were affected in many different places. And so there was never a kind of a rallying point, if you like, but also there was an orchestrated cover-up, in my view. And it's essential that this inquiry, whatever form it takes, looks at both the original negligence and the cover-up that followed.
What was covered up?
There has been evidence here of falsification of people's medical records, tests being done without people's knowledge or consent, and then the results of those tests, even when they confirmed a positive diagnosis of hepatitis C or HIV, not being communicated to the individuals affected, and then subsequently, in some cases, their partners being infected. That's the depth of this cover-up, and the effect of it has been to, in the case of falsification of medical notes, look like the individual was responsible for their health problems rather than the negligence of the state. So I have an example of a case where a very senior gentleman who worked with the government as a civil servant had his medical notes amended to suggest that he was a lifetime alcoholic, to suggest that his liver damage was his own responsibility. His widow has told me directly that that was pure falsification of his notes to make it look like he was to blame and not clinical negligence.
Given the time that's passed, how quickly should this inquiry report?
Well, obviously, as quickly as possible, and it's why I've always advocated the Hillsborough-style inquiry as the best way to get to truth and then subsequently to justice, because that was a disclosure panel. And what it did was it looked at all of the paperwork and then produced a report on the extent to which the revelation of that paperwork changed public understanding of what happened. And the panel was set up in the dying days of the Labour government, of which I was a member, so that was late 2009, and then it reported in September 2012. And that was because it had a very focused job to do. And I personally would say that something similar is needed here.
For what reason did you choose not to order this inquiry yourself when you were in government?
Well, that's a fair question. When I arrived in the Department of Health in 2009, the Archer report had just come out, and the government at the time had responded before I arrived in the department. So the Department of Health said to me, well, it's done, we've responded, and we've dealt with it. What I then inherited was a growing anger from people who were saying that, well, actually, it hasn't in any way answered our concerns. I then asked the department to reopen Contaminated Blood. Now, that was in March 2010, Eddie. Of course, we then ran out of time as a government. Let me put my hands up and say it wasn't enough. No political party has done enough for the victims of contaminated blood. They have been let down by all governments of all colours. And it's now incumbent on all political parties in this country to work together to ensure they get truth, justice and accountability without any further delay.
Didn't you also resist a public inquiry into the Mid-Staff's hospital scandal?
What I did was I brought in Sir Robert Francis to begin the inquiry into Stafford Hospital. People often forget that. I did that in July 2009. Now, yes, I suppose to answer your question fairly, it wasn't a full public inquiry, but it was an independent inquiry. And I've always argued, actually, that full public inquiries are not necessarily the quickest route to truth and justice. Public inquiries are right in some circumstances, but they are not always the quickest way to get to the truth.
Do you think, just finally, stepping back from these individual cases and complaints, that there's, and this, I suppose, brings Grenfell Tower into our most recent thinking, there is a sense among some people, isn't there, that ordinary folk of various kinds who feel they have real grievances have routinely, over the years, over successive governments, for many different reasons, been ignored, pushed away. Do you have a sense that there is something bigger at play here about how politicians, the political classes, and the media, perhaps, treat regular people with real grievances, who in some cases wait decades to be listened to?
Oh, I really do, Eddie. I think that is the right question. I have been involved in a number of issues of this kind now, and the pattern is always the same, that people who bring complaints are marginalised, in some cases actively denigrated. That was true of the Hillsborough families, but it's true here. As I said a moment ago, there's a very chilling echo of Hillsborough in the fact that people's medical notes were amended to suggest that they were alcoholic in respect of contaminated blood.
Do you think there's a case for some kind of body to examine these many complaints over the years so that it's not done on a piecemeal basis?
I've proposed what I call a Hillsborough law, which would tip the scales very firmly in favour of ordinary families, bereaved families, fighting for truth and justice, so that there is an onus on public bodies to be as transparent as possible at the first moment of complaint, that they should get equal legal funding in any inquests. At the moment, they don't get that, and you're absolutely right. The system does close ranks against them, and I think there is an element of class at play here where people are just dismissed, and it's easy for the system to do that. At times, there is too cosy a relationship between people in public bodies and the media, and a certain version of events is pushed out that isn't the correct version of events, and that can set back the quest for truth. So I think at every level here, people talk about an establishment. Well, I think that does exist. You have a network of relationships in high ranking positions in public bodies, in the media, in politics, and that can work against the interests of ordinary families fighting for truth and justice. And it's why I believe a Hillsborough law is needed.
Andy Burnham